My best friend called me sobbing at midnight, screaming that my boyfriend was obsessed with her. And by morning, I realized the girl I trusted, since middle school had been planning this moment for months. My phone rang at 11:04 p.m. and I almost didn't answer it. Brielle's name was on the screen, and I remember thinking, not tonight. I answered anyway. She was sobbing so hard I couldn't understand her at first. Just breath and static, and my name, over and over. Maren, I'm so sorry. I didn't want this to happen. Brielle, slow down. What happened? It's Owen. Her voice cracked on his name like it hurt to say it. He's in love with me. I've been trying to stop it for weeks. I didn't want to hurt you. I sat up in bed. Owen was asleep 4 feet away from me, one arm thrown over his eyes. Completely unaware his name was being said like a confession on the other end of a phone call. What are you talking about? He looks at me a certain way. He laughs at everything I say. Last week he told me my hair looked good, and I hadn't even done anything different. Maren, he just noticed. Nobody notices things like that unless they're paying attention to you. Owen notices things. He's observant. That doesn't mean you don't see it because you don't want to see it. Her voice sharpened, then collapsed back into tears. I know how this sounds. I know, but I can't keep pretending I don't feel it too. The ceiling fan above our bed ticked on its slow rotation, the only other sound in the room besides Brielle's breathing on the line, ragged and wet. I could smell the lavender candle Owen had lit hours earlier, burned down now to a puddle of wax on the nightstand, and it struck me as absurd that something so ordinary was still sitting there while my best friend fell apart in my ear over a man asleep beside me. I looked at Owen's sleeping face in the dark and felt something crack open in my chest, not because I believed her, but because some old, loyal part of me still didn't want to think she was lying. Brielle, I need you to say plainly what you think is happening. The heart wants what it wants, she said. I didn't ask for this. I woke Owen up. I put the call on speaker and held the phone between us like evidence. Say that again, I told her. Say it to both of us. There was a pause. Then her voice came through tinny and small. Owen, I know you feel it too. Owen sat up straighter, blinking against the light of my phone screen, his face doing the thing it does when he's trying to solve a math problem that doesn't add up. Feel what? Don't do that, Brielle said, and her voice had gone cold in a way I'd never heard from her. Don't act confused. Not now. Brielle, I don't know what you're talking about. You laughed at my joke on Tuesday. You said you liked my hair. You always sit closer to me than you need to. Owen looked at me, genuinely lost. I don't remember complimenting her hair. Before I could say anything else, Brielle's voice rose into a scream I felt in my back teeth. You're gaslighting me. You're actually gaslighting me right now. And then the call went dead. She'd hung up on him herself, mid-accusation, like she'd gotten what she needed and didn't want to hear the rebuttal. I sat there in the dark with the phone still warm in my hand, and Owen looked at me like he was waiting for me to explain something he didn't have the map for. I didn't have it either. Not yet. I told myself it would blow over by morning. I was wrong about almost everything that night, but I was most wrong about that. I met Brielle Castellan in the fall of 6th grade, in the cafeteria of Ridgemont Middle School, 2 weeks into the semester. She'd moved from Ohio, 3 states from anyone she knew, and she was sitting alone at the end of a long table with a tray of untouched pizza, staring at the wall like she was trying to disappear into it. I sat down across from her because the seat was open and because something about her face looked like mine had looked 6 months earlier, when my parents' divorce had turned me into the new kid in my own life. We didn't say much that first day. By the end of the week, we were inseparable. We grew up 9 minutes apart, in the kind of Ohio transplant cul-de-sac Pennsylvania town where everybody's mother knew everybody else's business. Brielle's house always felt a little too quiet, a little too clean, like nobody actually lived there so much as maintained it. Her mother worked long shifts at a hospital billing office in Allentown and came home tired in a way that made her irritable rather than warm. Her father had left before I ever met her, and Brielle talked about him the way you talk about weather in a country you've never visited, an abstract fact rather than a memory. I think that absence shaped more of her than either of us understood at 13. We went to different colleges. I stayed close at Kutztown, and she went 2 hours south to Millersville, but we never really let go of each other. We talked most days. I was her maid of honor, technically, at a wedding that got called off 11 days before the date, when her college boyfriend Denny told her he wasn't ready, and I spent that whole awful week sleeping on her dorm room floor while she cried in a way that scared me a little, a grief that seemed disproportionate to a relationship that had lasted barely a year. I told myself grief doesn't follow proportion. I didn't examine it any further than that. My own family history probably played a role in how long I stayed loyal past the point I should have. My parents divorced when I was in 5th grade, an ugly, drawn-out split involving my father's affair with a woman from his office, and 18 months of custody arguments that made me feel, for a while, like a piece of furniture being fought over rather than a person. I learned early that relationships could end without warning, that people you trusted could turn out to be building a separate life you knew nothing about. Brielle was the opposite of that lesson for 13 years. She was constant. She was the one relationship in my life that never once wavered, that never had a hidden second layer I discovered too late. I think that's exactly why I couldn't see the second layer when it finally appeared. I'd built her, in my own mind, into the one person who was safe from that particular kind of betrayal. It made me slow to recognize it, even as it was happening directly in front of me. I should have. Looking back now, there was a pattern even then, one I didn't have language for until much later. Brielle didn't experience romantic loss the way other people did. She experienced it as erasure, as if the breakup didn't just end a relationship but revoked invoked her right to exist in a story she'd already written for herself. After Denny, she deleted every photo of the two of them within an hour of him leaving, then spent the next 3 months following his new girlfriend's social media with a kind of forensic attention that unsettled me even as I made excuses for it. Everyone stalks their ex's new partner a little, I told myself. That's normal. It's not normal to memorize her class schedule. I met Owen Faraday at a mutual friend's barbecue in the summer I turned 26, 3 years after I'd moved into my own apartment in Emmaus and started working as a project coordinator for a mid-sized architecture firm. Owen was quiet in a room, the kind of quiet that made you curious rather than bored. He worked as a structural engineer for a firm downtown, the kind of job where he cared more about whether a beam could hold weight than whether he was the most interesting person at a party. He barely made eye contact with strangers. He forgot to laugh at jokes half the time because he was still processing the first half of the sentence. He was, in almost every observable way, the opposite of the kind of man who charms a room full of women without trying. Brielle liked him. At first, she told me so directly, sitting on my couch 3 weeks into me dating him, eating cold pad thai out of the container. He's good for you, she said. He actually listens when you talk. Denny never listened. I remember being relieved because Brielle's approval had always mattered to me more than I liked to admit. Some leftover loyalty from being 13 and friendless and rescued by a girl with sad eyes and a pizza she wasn't eating. The shift happened slowly enough that I couldn't pinpoint the day it started. Sometime around the 8-month mark of me and Owen dating, Brielle began mentioning him differently. Not with warmth anymore, but with a kind of clinical scrutiny, like she was building a file. He held the door a beat too long. He remembered she didn't like cilantro. He asked how her job interview went before I did, because I'd been in the bathroom when she walked in and he'd simply been paying attention. The way he paid attention to everything. Structurally, mechanically, the way you check a bridge for stress fractures. There's a detail from that period I didn't think much about until later. One that seems almost quaint now given everything that came after. In the spring before I met Owen, Brielle had gone through a stretch of what she called research mode about a coworker she liked. A guy named Theo who worked in her building's marketing department. She'd shown me his LinkedIn, his sister's wedding photos she'd found through a mutual tag, a restaurant he'd checked into 8 months earlier that she'd used to deduce his favorite cuisine. I remember laughing about it with her at the time, the two of us treating it like a scavenger hunt, like this was simply what modern dating looked like, a little digital sleuthing before the first date. Theo never asked her out. Within a month, she'd stopped mentioning him entirely, and when I asked what happened, she said only that it wasn't right, in a tone that closed the subject. I didn't think to ask what research mode meant for someone she was actually dating, someone who belonged to me first. I know now that the scavenger hunt never really stopped. It just found a more permanent target. Even the Denny breakup, looking back, had a strange coda I brushed past at the time. About 4 months after the wedding was called off, Denny reached out to Brielle asking if they could talk, a genuine, if belated, attempt at closure. Brielle called me that night euphoric, convinced this meant he wanted her back, describing a future that existed entirely inside her own head, an apartment they'd get, a wedding they'd reschedule for the following spring. When Denny made clear, gently but plainly, that he only wanted closure and had already started seeing someone new, Brielle didn't grieve it the way I expected. She got quiet for exactly 1 week, and then she told me, with total calm, that Denny was going through something and would come around eventually. He never did. She stopped mentioning him only when a new focus of her attention appeared to replace the old one. I didn't know, at 23, that I was watching a pattern establish itself. I know now. I want to be honest about the one earlier incident, the one that reads now like the opening chapter of a story I didn't know I was inside of. It was February, about a year before that midnight phone call, and the three of us had gone ice skating at a rink in Bethlehem. Owen fell twice, and Brielle laughed both times, not unkindly, and he laughed too. And at some point she grabbed his arm to steady herself on a turn and held on a half-second longer than the turn required. I noticed it. I filed it away as nothing, the kind of small physical familiarity that happens between friends. Later that night, walking to the car, Brielle told me, unprompted, "Owen's really easy to be around. I get why you like him so much." There was something underneath the sentence I couldn't name yet. I know exactly what it was now. It was reconnaissance. I should also say something about what our friendship looked like at its best, because it matters for understanding why I stayed loyal to her for as long as I did. Brielle was the person who drove 4 hours to sit with me in a hospital waiting room when my grandmother had a stroke, missing 2 days of work she couldn't afford to miss, an entry-level administrative job that docked her pay for unscheduled absences. She was the person who noticed, before anyone else did, that I'd stopped eating properly during my worst semester of college, and who started showing up at my dorm with groceries instead of asking if I was okay, because she understood I'd lie about being okay if asked directly. For 13 years she was, by every measure that mattered, someone who showed up. That's what made the unraveling so disorienting. It wasn't a slow erosion of a shallow relationship. It was a slow erosion of one of the deepest relationships of my life, and I kept mistaking the depth of the history for evidence that nothing was actually wrong. For the first 2 years of me and Owen's relationship, none of this rose to the surface in a way I could point to and call a problem. Brielle came to our anniversary dinners. She helped me pick out his birthday gifts. She was, by every visible measure, still my best friend, the one who'd known me since I was 11 years old and awkward and grieving a family that had come apart at the seams. That That history is not nothing. It's the reason I kept giving her the benefit of the doubt long after the doubt had stopped being reasonable. You don't unlearn 13 years of trust in a single conversation. You unlearn it in pieces, each one more expensive than the last. The morning after that midnight phone call, I woke up to 9 text messages from Brielle, sent between 1 a.m. and 4 a.m. The first few were apologetic. "I'm so sorry. I shouldn't have called like that. I was overwhelmed." By message 6, the tone had changed entirely. "I just think you deserve to know the truth about your own relationship." By message 9, there was no apology left in it at all. "He's not who you think he is, Marin. I've seen things you haven't." I called Owen before I called her back. He picked up on the first ring, which told me he hadn't slept either. "I genuinely don't understand what happened," he said. "I've never said anything to her that wasn't completely normal. I don't even remember complimenting her hair." "I know," I said, and I meant it, because in 3 years I had never once seen Owen behave toward Brielle with anything other than the mild, distracted friendliness he extended to everyone. He wasn't a flirt. He barely noticed when women flirted with him at work functions. I'd watched it happen and watched it sail entirely over his head. I texted Brielle back that morning, careful, measured. "I think you need to talk to someone about this. I don't think what you're describing is real, and I say that as someone who loves you." She didn't respond for 6 hours. When she did, it was one line: "You'll see." I gave her chance after chance to walk it back, and she never did. Not once. Not even a little. For the first week, it stayed at the level of unsettling text messages, sent at odd hours, always circling the same claim with new invented evidence. "He looked at me during the meeting today," she wrote, though she and Owen worked at different companies and had no shared meetings. "He liked my post before he liked yours," which is basically a language if you know how to read it. Each message asked me to interpret Owen's most mundane behaviors as coded declarations of love, and each time I declined, she escalated the specificity of the claim rather than questioning the premise. The first ceiling broke on a Tuesday, 11 days after the phone call, when Owen texted me from work in the middle of the afternoon, his messages shorter and more clipped than usual, the way they got when he was rattled. Brielle showed up at my office. Security walked her out. I called him immediately. He explained, voice tight, that she'd come up to the 14th floor without a visitor badge, told the receptionist she was there to see him, and when he came out to the lobby confused, she'd tried to hug him in front of his coworkers. When he stepped back, she'd started crying, loudly, in a way that made 3 separate people stop and stare. Security had to physically walk her to the elevator. I thought that was the bottom. I told myself, this is the worst of it, this is as far as it goes, because I still believed, on some level, that Brielle's behavior operated within the boundaries of normal heartbreak, however misdirected. I was wrong. It was not the bottom. It was the first floor of a building with many more floors beneath it. 4 days later, Owen mentioned, almost in passing, that he'd noticed a woman at his gym who looked like Brielle. I told him it probably wasn't her. His gym was 15 minutes from his apartment, on the opposite side of town from where Brielle lived. He agreed it was probably a coincidence. It was not a coincidence. 2 days after that, he canceled his membership and switched to a different gym across town, one he'd never mentioned to Brielle, one I hadn't even known the name of until he told me he was joining it. Within 8 days, she was there too, on the elliptical 2 machines down from his, wearing workout clothes I recognized from her Instagram, timing her arrival to match his. He didn't know how she'd found it, neither did I. I still don't, fully, though I have theories now that make my skin crawl. She'd have needed his new gym's name, which meant she'd either followed him there in person or gone through something of his. I didn't let myself follow that thought all the way at the time. I do now. Quick pause from the story. If you enjoy these stories, consider taking a listen to our Spotify show, linked in the description for early access to new stories in better audio quality. Now back to the video. Our mutual friends started to notice, and this is the part that still makes something twist in my stomach when I think about it, because it wasn't the strangers or the security guards who first started giving Owen strange looks. It was people who'd known both of us for years. Brielle had a talent, and I use that word deliberately, for delivering her version of events with a certainty so complete that it made the truth sound like the thing that needed defending. She told our friend Priya over coffee that she was going through something incredibly painful and asked her not to say anything to me, framing it as protecting my feelings rather than concealing information. She told our old college roommate Denise that Owen had reached out to her first, months ago, and that she'd been trying to do the right thing by not acting on it until she couldn't hold it in anymore. None of it was true. All of it sounded, delivered in Brielle's steady, wounded voice, entirely plausible. By the 3rd week, I could feel a strange currents of doubt moving through my friend group. Not doubt about Owen exactly, but doubt about the shape of the story. A sense that maybe there was smoke because there must be fire, that a person doesn't invent something this elaborate for no reason. I want to be honest about my own blind spot here, because it's not fair to tell this story as though I saw everything clearly from the start. There was a night, about 3 weeks in, when I lay awake next to Owen and let myself actually consider the possibility that some tiny percentage of what Brielle was saying might be true. Not the delusion itself, but the underlying accusation that Owen had, in some small, deniable way, enjoyed her attention. I brought it up to him directly, at 2 in the morning, my voice flat in the dark. Did you ever, even once, do anything that could have made her think this was mutual? He didn't get defensive. He turned on the lamp and looked at me and said, I want you to think about every single time we've been in a room with her. Have I ever once made you feel like something was happening that shouldn't have been? And the the honest answer was no, never. Not once in 3 years had I ever felt a flicker of that particular unease. I'd felt jealous of other things in my life. I'd never felt it about him and Brielle, because there had never been anything there to feel jealous of. That conversation was the last time I let the doubt in. After that night, I understood that the story wasn't about what Owen had done. It was about what Brielle needed to be true. The manipulation tactics escalated in a pattern I could only fully see once I stepped back from it, the way you can only see a maze from above. First came the victim framing. She was the one suffering, the one trying to do the right thing, the one being hurt by circumstances beyond her control. Then came the weaponizing of our shared history, invoking 13 years of friendship as leverage, as though loyalty to her required me to at least entertain her version of events. After everything we've been through, you're going to take his side? She asked me on a call in early March, and I remember feeling the old pull of it, the muscle memory of being loyal to Brielle above all else, before I caught myself and named what she was actually doing. It wasn't a question about loyalty. It was a demand that I abandon reality in favor of her narrative, dressed up as a test of friendship. Then came the isolation tactic, though I didn't recognize it as one until much later. Brielle began reaching out to people in my life individually. My coworker, my aunt, even my hairdresser, who Brielle had met exactly twice, sowing small seeds of doubt about Owen's character, framing herself as someone reluctantly coming forward with concerning information. "I just think you deserve people who tell you the truth," she told my coworker Faith in a conversation Faith later relayed to me almost verbatim, still visibly unsettled by how convincing Brielle had sounded. The goal, I understood eventually, wasn't actually to convince anyone that Owen loved her. The goal was to surround me with enough ambient suspicion that I'd start to doubt my own judgment, that I'd need Brielle more, not less, to help me see clearly. It's a manipulation that only works on people who love you. Strangers are immune to it. That's what made it so effective and so exhausting to fight. There was a moment during that period, a rainy Thursday in late February, when Brielle showed up unannounced at my apartment while Owen was at work, carrying a small box of things, friendship bracelets we'd made at 14, a mixtape neither of us had a working device to play anymore, a photo strip from a boardwalk arcade in Wildwood. She sat on my kitchen floor with the box between us and cried, telling me she just wanted her best friend back, that none of this was about Owen at all, that she missed me. For almost 20 minutes, I let myself believe it, let myself hold her while she cried, let myself think maybe this was the turning point, the moment she stepped back from whatever cliff she'd been walking along. Then softly, into my shoulder, she said, "I just need you to understand why I feel what I feel about him. If you understood that, this would all be so much easier." The whole visit had been leverage dressed as nostalgia. I walked her to the door 20 minutes later, gently, and cried myself once she was gone, grieving a version of that scene that could have been real and wasn't. Each time I thought we'd reached the ceiling, she found a way through it. When the gym incident happened, I told her, in a text I drafted 4 times before sending, that she needed to stop contacting Owen directly and get some professional support, because whatever she was experiencing was not rooted in anything real. She responded that she'd expected me to say that Owen had probably coached me to say exactly that, and that she forgave me in advance for not being able to see the truth yet. There is no version of a person you can reason with when every rebuttal becomes further proof of the conspiracy. I understand that now. At the time, it just felt like screaming into a canyon and hearing my own voice come back distorted. The detail that would matter later, the one I didn't understand the significance of until weeks after, happened during the gym period. Owen mentioned, almost as an aside, that his work calendar had gone strange. Meetings he didn't remember scheduling showing up, then disappearing, small glitches he chalked up to IT issues with the new scheduling software his firm had rolled out that spring. He mentioned it because it was mildly annoying, not because he thought it mattered. I filed it away the way you file away weather. I had no idea, not yet, that this detail would become the single thread that unraveled everything Brielle had built. Before the email to Owen's supervisor, there was a smaller, quieter escalation that I almost didn't count as part of the pattern until I looked back at the whole timeline laid out on Graham's whiteboard. In early March, my own office manager, a kind but easily flustered woman named Ruth, pulled me aside after a staff meeting to ask, delicately, if everything was okay at home. When I asked why, she said a woman claiming to be a close family friend had called the front desk, asking whether I'd seemed stressed lately, and whether the office had any employee wellness resources available, framing it as concern rather than intrusion. Ruth hadn't given out any information, professional to the end, but she'd taken down the caller's number out of habit. It matched a number Brielle had used to text me twice from before switching to a different phone entirely, a detail Graham later flagged as evidence of premeditation. She'd been managing multiple lines of contact designed to reach the people around me without appearing, at a glance, to be her. I don't know what she hoped to accomplish by contacting my workplace directly. I think, in hindsight, it was never really about accomplishing anything specific. It was about maintaining a foothold in every room I occupied, even the ones that had nothing to do with Owen at all. There was one more ceiling before the one at his parents' house, and it's the one that still makes Owen go quiet when it comes up, because it touched the one part of his life he'd worked hardest to protect from any of this, his career. In mid-March, Brielle sent an email to Owen's direct supervisor, a senior structural engineer named Priyanka Rao, using a personal account made to look, at a glance, like it belonged to someone in HR. The email claimed that Owen was involved in an inappropriate personal situation situation that may pose a safety concern for staff, vague enough to sound official, specific enough to demand a response. Priyanka, to her credit, didn't act on it directly. She forwarded it to actual HR and quietly gave Owen a heads up that something strange had landed in her inbox with his name on it. Owen came home that night and told me, sitting on the edge of our bed with his hands pressed flat against his knees, that for the first time since this began, he was afraid it would cost him his job, not because he'd done anything wrong, but because the mere appearance of chaos around his name was enough to make people wary. HR investigated, found nothing, and closed the inquiry within a week, but the email stayed in a file somewhere at his firm, a permanent, if minor, blemish attached to a man who had never once given his employer a reason for concern in 6 years of employment there. I remember thinking, distinctly, that this was the moment Brielle stopped being someone chasing a fantasy and became someone willing to burn down anything standing between her and the story she needed to be real, including a stranger's professional reputation, including a company that had nothing to do with any of it. By late March, 6 weeks after the phone call, Brielle found Owen's parents' address. I still don't fully know how. She may have found it in an old holiday card of mine, or pulled it from a mutual contact, or simply searched public records the way people do now with a frightening amount of ease. What I know is that on a Sunday evening, during his parents' regular family dinner, a tradition Owen's mother, Denise Faraday, had kept every week for as long as he'd been alive, Brielle let herself in through an unlocked side door and sat down at their dining table like she'd been invited. Owen's father, Marcus, told me later that his first thought was that she was a friend of Owen's sister because she walked in with such total ease, greeting no one, simply pulling out a chair and sitting. Marcus is not an easily rattled man. He'd spent 30 years running his own contracting business and had a way of sizing up a situation before reacting to it, a trait Owen clearly inherited, and even he admitted afterward that it took him a full minute to understand a stranger had simply joined dinner uninvited, because Brielle's body language gave no indication she believed she was doing anything unusual. It took a full 30 seconds for anyone at that table to understand that a stranger had joined their dinner. Owen, seated across the table, went white. He told me afterward it felt like watching two entirely separate parts of his life collide in a way his brain couldn't process fast enough. Brielle looked directly at Owen's mother and said with total composure, "I think you should know that Owen has been reaching out to me for months. I've tried to stop it. I didn't want to be the reason his relationship ended, but I can't keep carrying this alone anymore." Owen's mother, to her credit, asked the obvious question, "Who are you?" "I'm Brielle, Marin's best friend." The word best friend landed in that dining room like a small explosion, because everyone at that table knew exactly who Marin was, knew I'd been dating Owen for 3 years, and understood in that instant that whatever this was, it was not a simple misunderstanding walking in off the street. Owen backed toward the kitchen, according to his sister Lila, who described him as looking like he wanted to disappear into the wallpaper. Marcus stood up and told Brielle firmly that she needed to leave. She didn't move. She said she wasn't leaving until Owen admitted his real feelings out loud, in front of everyone, a phrase Lila remembered precisely because of how theatrical it sounded, like a line rehearsed in a mirror. Owen, still ashen, said, "Brielle, there's nothing to admit. I don't know why you're doing this." She started crying then, the same performance I'd heard through my phone 6 weeks earlier, and told the table that this was exactly the kind of denial she'd been warning everyone about. I got the call from Owen while I was still in my pajamas, folding laundry on a Sunday I remember as ordinary right up until it wasn't. I got to his parents' house in 10 minutes flat, breaking 2 speed limits I will not admit to in detail. Brielle met me on the porch before I'd even reached the door, and instead of the tears from the dining room, her voice had gone hard and fast, aimed now at anyone within earshot on that quiet suburban street. She told the neighbors, several of whom had come out onto their own porches to watch, that I had been controlling Owen for months, monitoring his phone, cutting him off from his friends, and that she was only telling the truth because she cared about him too much to stay silent. I stood on that porch and felt something in me go very still and very clear, the way I imagine it feels right before a car crash, when time slows down enough that you can see every individual piece of glass before it shatters. I didn't scream back. I didn't try to outshout her. I said, loud enough for the street to hear, "Brielle, you need to leave, or I'm calling the police." She laughed, actually laughed, and said, "Go ahead, let's see who they believe." Marcus had already called them. 2 officers arrived within 11 minutes, and I watched Brielle transform in real time, the wildness draining out of her voice, replaced by something calm and rehearsed, a softness she deployed like a costume change. She smiled at the responding officer, a young guy who couldn't have been older than 26, and said she was so sorry for the confusion, that this was simply a misunderstanding between old friends. It was, I realized later, the first time I'd watched her perform for an audience that had no prior loyalty to her, and the performance nearly worked. The officer asked Owen directly, standing in his parents' driveway with his whole family watching, "Is she your girlfriend?" "No," Owen said, clearly. "She's my girlfriend's friend. I've never had any relationship with her beyond that." The officer asked again, maybe out of procedure, maybe because Brielle's composure had rattled his red on the situation. "You're sure?" "I'm positive," Owen said. "I've been with Marin for 3 years. I don't know this woman outside of that." I watched Brielle's face come apart in front of everyone on that street, not gradually, all at once, like a held breath finally released, her carefully constructed calm collapsing into something raw and furious. She turned to Owen, eyes wet, and said, in a voice that carried across 3 front lawns, "You're a liar. You know what we have." Marcus put a hand on his wife's shoulder. Lila had her phone out, though I don't know if she was recording or just holding on to something solid. As the officers walked her toward her car, informing her that she was trespassing and could be facing further consequences if she returned, she screamed back at Owen, not pleading, not sad anymore, but something closer to a threat. "You're going to regret this. You'll come crawling back, and I won't be there." Then quieter, meant only for me, though the whole street still heard it. "You did this. You turned him against me." My cousin Kayla works in crisis intervention at a hospital in Reading, and I called her that night, still shaking, describing everything from the midnight phone call through the scene in the driveway. She listened for a long time without interrupting, and when I finished, she said something I've thought about almost daily since. There's a specific pattern, she told me, where a person experiences rejection or the absence of romantic interest and reconstructs it internally as a secret, mutual attraction being suppressed by outside forces, the girlfriend, the family, social convention. It's not something a person simply talks themselves out of. It tends to intensify, not soften, when it's directly challenged, because every denial gets reabsorbed as further evidence of the conspiracy. Kayla didn't diagnose Brielle over the phone. She was careful about that, professionally careful, but she said gently that what I was describing didn't sound like something that would resolve with more patience or more explaining. She told me, in the plainest terms she could manage, that we needed a lawyer immediately, not eventually. We sat in a lawyer's office 9 days later. Graham Whitfield, a family friend of Owen's who specialized in exactly this kind of case, a squat, unhurried man with a way of making terrifying situations sound procedural rather than catastrophic. We spent 3 hours building a timeline, screenshots, dated, and organized. The security incident report from Owen's office building, the police report from his parents' driveway, statements from Priya and Denise, our mutual friends, describing the calls Brielle had made trying to recruit them. Graham said, tapping the folder closed at the end of those 3 hours, that we had more than enough for a restraining order, and likely enough for the district attorney's office to consider criminal stalking charges, given the trespassing, the repeated unwanted contact, and the office incident. He warned us, in a tone that made it clear he'd seen this exact escalation play out before, that filing might make things worse before it made them better. People like Brielle, he said carefully, without using any clinical language he wasn't qualified to use, tend to interpret legal consequences as further proof that the world is conspiring against a love that's real. He was right. He was right almost immediately. 2 days after we filed for the protective order, before it had even been formally served, Brielle was arrested trying to walk into Owen's office building. She'd been formally banned from the property after the first incident. Her name and photo flagged at the front desk, and she'd shown up anyway, telling the same receptionist from before that she had an appointment. When security recognized her and asked her to leave, she reportedly tried to push past them toward the elevator bank, and the responding officers, called by building security, arrested her on the spot for criminal trespass. I found out about it from Graham, not from Owen, because Owen had stopped being able to talk about any of it without his hands shaking, a tremor I'd never seen in him before, not once in 3 years, not through deadline crunches or family arguments or anything else life had thrown at him. The hearing for the protective order was set for the following Thursday, and Owen and I sat outside the courtroom on a hard wooden bench that morning, neither of us saying much, both of us watching the door like it might open onto something worse than what we'd already lived through. When Brielle walked in, she was wearing a blue dress and her hair was curled, done in a way I recognized from special occasions we'd shared together over the years. Her cousin's graduation, a work gala she'd been nervous about. She looked, I remember thinking with a kind of sick clarity, like she was dressed for a first date rather than a courtroom. Her lawyer, a tired-looking public defender who kept glancing at his watch, tried twice to get her to sit and face forward. She kept turning around in her seat, craning her neck to find Owen, and when she did, she smiled at him. Soft, private, the kind of smile you give someone across a room when you share a secret nobody else in the building knows about. Graham laid out the case for the judge with the same unhurried precision he'd used in his office. The text messages, the office incident, the trespassing at Owen's parents' house, the gym, the second arrest. He called our coworker Faith to the stand, who confirmed, in a steady voice I was grateful for, the conversation Brielle had tried to have with her, framing herself as a reluctant truth-teller. Brielle's own lawyer objected periodically, but I watched his shoulders sink lower with each new piece of evidence entered into the record. The particular posture of a man who understood he'd been handed a case with no real defense. During a 10-minute recess, I heard Brielle's voice through the closed conference room door, high and insistent, telling her lawyer that none of it meant what it looked like, that there was context missing, that if the judge would just let Owen speak honestly for once, everyone would understand. When she took the stand herself, over her lawyer's visible reluctance, she spoke with the same total conviction I'd heard on that first midnight phone call, describing conversations with Owen that had never happened. A conversation at a barbecue 18 months ago, where he'd allegedly told her he wished things were different. A text exchange, which she claimed to have deleted out of respect for Marin, where he'd supposedly said he thought about her constantly. I know for a fact none of it occurred, because I was standing beside Owen at that barbecue, close enough to have heard every word exchanged, and Owen doesn't delete text messages. He's never once deleted one in the entire time I've known him, a habit that used to mildly mildly annoy me and would, within the hour, become the single most important detail in the entire case. The judge, a woman named Judge Okafor, whose expression had been carefully neutral through most of the proceeding, began to shift as Brielle spoke, her face moving from professional patience to something sharper, more alert. She asked Brielle to clarify the date of the alleged text exchange. Brielle answered with total certainty, a Tuesday in February the 20th. She remembered because it was the day after Valentine's Day, and she'd felt guilty about it. Graham stood and asked the judge for permission to enter one additional piece of evidence he hadn't planned to use: Owen's work calendar, requested by subpoena from his firm's IT department after the pattern of strange calendar glitches Owen had mentioned to me months earlier. The detail I'd filed away as nothing, as weather, as background noise. Graham had pulled the calendar not to disprove Brielle's timeline specifically, but simply to establish Owen's whereabouts on the days in question, standard due diligence for a case like this. He hadn't known, until that morning, what it would actually reveal. The calendar showed, for the exact date Brielle had cited under oath, Tuesday, February the 20th, that Owen had been logged into a client-site verification meeting from 1:15 p.m. to 4:45 p.m., and a meeting with a paper trail of sign-in sheets, badge scans, and a project manager who could confirm his physical presence 40 minutes outside the city, nowhere near a phone, nowhere near anywhere Brielle could have received the message she described. But that wasn't the detail that made the courtroom go quiet. What made it go quiet was what Graham found sitting 3 rows down in the calendar's revision history. The metadata IT had included in the subpoena response almost as an afterthought, a log of edits made to Owen's calendar entries over the preceding 4 months, time-stamped, attributed to a login that wasn't his. Owen's calendar had been accessed and modified 19 separate times since November, always in small ways. A meeting shifted by 20 minutes, an appointment renamed, a block of time marked unavailable for reasons that didn't correspond to anything on his actual schedule. Someone had been inside his calendar for months, quietly rearranging small pieces of his time, and the access had come from a device registered to a personal email account that Owen didn't recognize, one that took Graham's paralegal less than an hour to trace back to a domain Brielle had created herself the previous October, a domain built to look, at a glance, like it belonged to Owen's firm. Graham's paralegal, a sharp young woman named Isla, who'd clearly done this kind of digital tracing before, walked the courtroom through the technical details in language even a room full of non-specialists could follow. The domain Brielle had registered, a near-identical misspelling of Owen's firm's actual domain, differing by a single transposed letter easy to miss at a glance, had been created on October 9th of the previous year, complete with a working email inbox and a login portal she'd used to request limited calendar sharing access from Owen's real account, disguised as a routine IT migration notice. Owen, trusting and unsuspicious in the specific way of someone who has never had reason to doubt an official-looking email from his own company, had approved the access request without a second thought, the way most people click through dozens of such requests every year without incident. From that single approval, granted in October, Brielle had quiet, persistent visibility into every entry on his calendar for 4 straight months, watching his schedule shift and settle in real time, occasionally nudging small blocks of it herself to create the gaps and glitches he'd mentioned to me only in passing, as background noise, as nothing. I felt the floor of the entire story shift under me in that moment. This hadn't been a delusion that simply happened to her, a spontaneous rejection reframed by a wounded mind. Someone had been building this for months. Someone had gained access to Owen's professional calendar back in October, 4 months before that midnight phone call, and had been quietly manufacturing small inconsistencies, small gaps, small pieces of evidence she could later point to, laying the groundwork for a story she intended to tell long before she ever told it to me. The forgotten meetings Owen mentioned as an annoying IT glitch, the blank space on his calendar the day she swore he'd confessed his feelings. None of it was coincidence. It was construction. She hadn't been swept up in a delusion. She'd been the architect of one brick by brick for 4 months, waiting for the right moment to light the match. Graham asked the court's permission to display the domain registration date and the access logs. Judge Okafor granted it. And before Graham could even finish framing the question he was about to ask Brielle about the discrepancy, she turned in the witness chair and looked directly at Owen, not at the judge, not at her own lawyer frantically trying to get her attention, but at Owen, and she smiled. Not a nervous smile, not a frightened one. A satisfied smile, slow and complete, like she'd been waiting her entire life for this exact moment in this exact room, like being caught was somehow still, in the architecture of whatever story she'd built inside her own head, a form of being seen. "You didn't have to make it this hard," she said to him, quiet, almost gentle, as if the courtroom around her had disappeared entirely. "We could have just talked." The room went silent in a way I'd never experienced before, the particular silence of dozens of people, simultaneously understanding the same terrible thing. Owen's hand found mine on the bench and gripped it hard enough to hurt, and I let it hurt, because it was the only thing in that moment that felt honest. Judge Okafor didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She said evenly that the evidence presented, the calendar intrusion, the fabricated domain, the pattern of contact across 4 months, the trespassing, the 2 prior incidents at Owen's workplace and his parents' home, constituted more than sufficient grounds, not only for the protective order, but for a referral to the district attorney attorney's office regarding possible charges of stalking, unauthorized computer access, and identity-related fraud given the fake domain built to impersonate Owen's employer. Brielle's lawyer asked for a recess to confer with his client. Brielle didn't seem to hear him. She was still looking at Owen, and Owen, for the first time since that midnight phone call 8 weeks earlier, looked back at her without flinching, without confusion, without any trace of the bewildered kindness that had made him such an easy target for a story that needed a devoted, patient man at its center. He looked at her the way you'd look at a stranger. "There's nothing to talk about, Brielle," he said. "There never was." The protective order was granted that day, a full no-contact order covering me, Owen, both sets of his parents, and his workplace, effective immediately, with a hearing on the criminal referral scheduled for the following month. Graham told us in the hallway afterward, gathering his files with the same unhurried calm he'd carried all morning, that the computer intrusion charge alone, given the fabricated domain and 4 months of documented unauthorized access, could carry real weight. Not a slap on the wrist, not a fine and a stern warning, but something with actual teeth. I remember standing in that marble hallway, fluorescent lights humming overhead, and feeling nothing like triumph. I felt hollowed out, scraped clean, like something essential had been removed from me, and I hadn't yet located the wound. The consequences didn't stop at the courthouse doors. Word moves fast in a town the size of ours, and within a week, the story had reached nearly everyone in our overlapping circles, though not through me. I told almost no one the details voluntarily. It traveled through the mutual friends Brielle had tried to recruit months earlier, the same people she'd called to plant doubt about Owen, now calling each other back to piece together what had actually happened. Priya called me in tears, apologizing for having entertained, even briefly, the possibility that there was truth in what Brielle had told her. Denise, our old college roommate, sent a long message admitting she'd started to wonder if I was the one being unreasonable, and that she felt sick about it now, knowing what the calendar logs had shown. I didn't blame either of them, not really. Brielle had been convincing because she believed every word she said. That's what made her dangerous. A liar who knows they're lying gives things away. A person who has fully absorbed their own fabrication doesn't. Brielle's mother, Carol, called me 9 days after the hearing, and it was one of the strangest, saddest conversations of my life. She didn't defend her daughter. She didn't ask me to drop the charges or soften my position. She asked instead, in a voice worn thin by something that sounded like exhaustion accumulated over years, whether I'd noticed anything like this before, any earlier pattern, any earlier obsession, anything she should have caught and hadn't. I told her about Denny, about the college boyfriend and the photos deleted within an hour, the month spent monitoring his new girlfriend's every post. Carol was quiet for a long time on the other end of the line. "I should have gotten her help after that," she finally said. "I thought it was just heartbreak. Everybody goes through heartbreak." I didn't know what to tell her, because I'd made the exact same mistake, just from a different angle, for a much longer time. Before we hung up, Carol asked if she could still call me occasionally, not about the case, just to talk, and I said yes. And we have every few months since, 2 women who loved the same person from different distances and are still, in our own separate ways, trying to understand what happened to her. Brielle's arraignment on the criminal charges happened 3 weeks later, and I didn't attend. Graham told me afterward that she'd pleaded not guilty to the stalking and computer intrusion charges, that her lawyer was already signaling an intent to argue diminished capacity, that the case would likely stretch on for months, possibly longer. I found, to my own surprise, that I didn't want daily updates. I asked Graham to only contact me with major developments and let the rest of it move forward without my constant attention, because I understood, somewhere in that first month, that continuing to track every procedural step of Brielle's unraveling wasn't justice-seeking anymore. It was a different kind of obsession, and I didn't want to become someone who needed that particular story to keep unfolding in order to feel okay. Priyanka reached out to Owen personally once the criminal case became public within the firm, something he hadn't expected from a supervisor he'd always found somewhat distant. She told him the false HR email suddenly made a lot more sense in context, and she apologized, unnecessarily but sincerely, for the week he'd spent worrying his job might be in jeopardy over something he had no control over. She became, in her own understated way, another one of the people who stepped forward when the truth finally caught up to the story Brielle had built. Owen's firm ended up updating their internal verification procedures for HR complaints, partly because of what happened, requiring a second confirmation step before any personnel inquiry could be opened. A small procedural footnote that neither of us take much comfort in, but that at least means the next person targeted this way might not spend a week believing their career is quietly unraveling over an email that was never real. There were unexpected allies in the aftermath, people I hadn't anticipated leaning on. Owen's sister Lila, who I'd always liked but never been especially close to, started texting me regularly, first to check in, then just to talk, and somewhere in those weeks she became one of the people I trusted most with the parts of the story I couldn't say out loud yet. Marcus, Owen's father, a man I'd previously experienced as somewhat reserved, showed up at our apartment one evening with a toolbox and, without much explanation, spent 2 hours installing a security camera by our front door, the kind of gesture that said more than any conversation could have, one that took him an entire Saturday afternoon he hadn't been asked for and that he never once mentioned again, as though installing it were simply something a father does, no different from checking the oil in his kids' cars mirrors or making sure the smoke detectors worked. My cousin Kayla, the one who'd first named the pattern for me on that terrible night, connected me with a therapist who specialized in exactly this kind of aftermath, not grief over a romantic loss, but the specific, disorienting grief of losing a friendship to something that had apparently never been entirely what it appeared to be. Brielle made a few final, desperate moves before the no-contact order fully closed off her access to our lives. She created a new social media account under a different name and tried to follow both Owen and me within days of the old accounts being blocked. She sent a long email to my work address, a clear violation of the order, insisting that everything she'd said had come from a genuine place, that she'd never meant to hurt anyone, that the calendar access had been a misguided attempt to understand Owen better, not to manipulate anyone. Graham forwarded the email straight to the district attorney's office as an additional violation, and I never responded to it. There was nothing left to say that 13 years of friendship and 8 weeks of devastation hadn't already said for both of us. I started seeing the therapist Kayla recommended, a woman named Dr. Osei, who worked out of a small practice above a bakery in Allentown, and our early sessions were less about Owen and more about untangling 13 years of friendship from the 8 weeks that had apparently unmade it. She asked me once, in our 4th session, to describe Brielle in one sentence without using the word loyal. I sat with that question longer than I expected to, because loyal had been the load-bearing word of our entire friendship, the thing I'd used to justify every uncomfortable moment, every dismissed red flag, every time some instinct in me had said something's off here and I'd talked myself back down. Without that word, I found I didn't have as clean a sentence as I wanted. What I eventually said was, she was the first person who ever made me feel chosen, and I think some part of her needed to be chosen back so badly that she stopped being able to tell the difference between being chosen and simply deciding she already was. Dr. Osei wrote that down. I still think about it more than almost anything else I said in those sessions. In a later session, she asked whether I thought I could have done anything differently to catch it sooner, and I told her the honest answer, which was that I'd replayed the ice rink, the barbecue, the boardwalk photos 100 times each, and every single time, in the moment itself, nothing about them had looked like danger. They'd looked like affection. That's the part people don't understand when they hear a story like this secondhand and ask, gently or not so gently, how you didn't see it coming. You don't see it coming because it's built out of the same materials as love. That's the whole design of it. The grief hit me in an unexpected place. Weeks after the adrenaline of the courtroom and the arrests and the security cameras had faded into something quieter. I was cleaning out a closet on an ordinary Saturday and found a photo of me and Brielle at 16, sitting on the hood of her mother's Honda Civic outside Ridgemont High, both of us laughing at something neither of us would remember now, her arm slung around my shoulders like it belonged there. I sat on the floor of that closet and cried in a way I hadn't let myself cry through any of the legal proceedings, because that girl in the photo, the one who'd sat with me at lunch when I had no one, the one who'd known every version of me from 11 years old onward, that girl was real. She existed. And somewhere between then and the phone call at 11:04 p.m., and something in her had broken in a way I never saw coming and will never fully understand, and I lost her twice. Once to whatever was actually happening inside her, and once to the version of her I'd been keeping alive in my memory long after she'd stopped being that person. The financial toll of those 8 weeks added up in ways I hadn't anticipated when it was all still unfolding in real time. Graham's initial consultation and the work building the protective order case ran us just under $4,000, an amount we split down the middle without either of us really discussing it, because by that point the cost of not acting had become obviously higher than the cost of the legal fees. Owen's firm covered the HR investigation internally, but the week he'd spent distracted and anxious cost him, by his own estimate, several billable hours he had to make up on a weekend, unpaid, just to stay current on a client deadline. We briefly discussed moving apartments entirely, getting further from both of our workplaces and starting somewhere Brielle had never had reason to know about, before deciding the security camera and the no-contact order gave us enough of a buffer to stay put. That decision felt some nights like defiance. Other nights it just felt like exhaustion, the simple unwillingness to let one more piece of our life get rearranged by her. There were logistical complications that stretched on for months after the hearing. Graham helping us navigate a formal complaint with Owen's building management, a separate civil consultation about whether we could pursue damages related to the fabricated domain and the professional disruption it caused Owen at work, conversations with his firm's IT department about additional security measures on his accounts. None of it was dramatic in the way the courtroom scene had been. It was paperwork, follow-up calls, small administrative tasks that dragged the whole ordeal out far longer than the emotional climax suggested it should. I remember being surprised by how much of trauma's aftermath is simply logistics. Forms, appointments, phone calls to insurance and IT and lawyers, long after the feeling of danger has technically passed. Owen and I don't talk about Brielle often anymore, but when we do, it's without the sharpness that used to color every mention of her name in the first months. He told me once, on a drive back from his parents' house, that what unsettled him most in hindsight wasn't the dinner table or the driveway or even the courtroom, but realizing how much of a stranger's private architecture, his calendar, his gym schedule, the interior rhythm of his ordinary days, had been quietly accessible to someone determined enough to look. He's more careful now in small, permanent ways. Different passwords, two-factor authentication on accounts he used to leave wide open, a habit of glancing at his calendar each morning just to make sure it still matches what he remembers agreeing to. It's a small tax on his peace of mind that he didn't used to have to pay, and I think about that sometimes, how the people who hurt us leave behind these little maintenance costs long after the headline events are over. I have my own version of that tax. I still flinch, faintly, when my phone rings after 11 at night, even now, even 14 months removed from the call that started all of it, even knowing the number that broke something in me back then can no longer reach me at all. It's been 14 months now since that phone call. Owen and I got engaged in the fall, a quiet proposal on the same trail where we'd had our first real conversation years earlier. Nothing showy, exactly the kind of thing that fits both of us. Brielle's criminal case resolved through a plea agreement I only know the broad outlines of, some form of supervised probation, mandated psychiatric evaluation, a permanent restraining order that will outlast most ordinary friendships by decades. I don't know where she is now. I've made peace with not knowing. I think about that midnight phone call sometimes, still, usually at odd moments, waiting in line somewhere, half asleep on a Sunday morning. I used to think the lesson of all this was about vigilance, about learning to spot manipulation earlier, about never again extending the kind of blind loyalty that let a 4-month campaign unfold right under my nose disguised as heartbreak. I don't think that's quite it anymore. The real lesson, the one I actually carry now, is that love, even the platonic, 13 years deep kind, doesn't obligate you to abandon what you know to be true, no matter how convincingly someone insists otherwise. Being loyal to a person is not the same as being loyal to whatever story they need you to believe. Sometimes, driving past Ridgemont Middle School on my way to my parents' house, I still slow down without meaning to, half expecting to see two 13-year-olds sitting on the curb out front, one of them new to town and friendless, the other one deciding, without knowing what it would eventually cost her, to sit down beside her anyway. I don't regret that decision. I don't think I ever will, even now, even knowing everything I know. Choosing kindness at 11 years old isn't a mistake just because the person on the other end of it grew into someone who couldn't hold on to it honestly. The mistake, if there was one, was mine alone, and it happened much later, in believing that 13 years of history was itself a kind of proof, when it was never anything more than a shared past that both of us were free to walk away from differently, in our own time, in our own separate directions, carrying different versions of the same 13 years for the rest of our lives. I still miss her. Not the version who called me sobbing at midnight, not the woman who sat down uninvited at a stranger's dinner table and rearranged a man's calendar for 4 months to build a case against a relationship that never existed. I miss the girl on the hood of that Honda Civic, the one who saved me a seat when I had nowhere else to sit. That girl was real, and she's the one I lost, long before I understood I was losing her, in pieces too small to notice, until the night my phone rang at 11:04, and everything I thought I knew about the person I trusted since middle school turned out to have been planned, quietly, patiently, for months.